In our last session, we stopped at the point where we launched JupyterLab, and then we logged into the UI. So this is the JupyterLab UI. And today, the goal is to have a walkthrough about on what you can do in JupyterLab. But before we do that, there is something I would like to talk about in terms of how is the connection being made, especially inside through Docker. Because if you take a step back and you think about how this software works, this JupyterLab, there's a server behind it, right? And and this server is created when you call the JupyterLab, when you execute the JupyterLab command. And this server is residing inside a Docker container that you created when you execute the reopen in container command palette in VS Code. Now, being a container, this is supposed to be a sandbox environment, means there's a separation between your host operating system, your Mac, and whatever goes on inside that container. So the question is, how are you able to connect to the server that is inside your container if you're supposed to have a separate environment, right? To answer that, the reason you are able to connect is because when you create a container, you can tell Docker that you want to have certain ports open. Let me explain more by way of an example. So if you go back to the VS Code, can you click here? And then, so do you see that, oops. So do you see that port section?
Yep.
Yep. So this is telling you what are the ports that are currently that have been opened and forwarded to your container. If you remember, and one way to specify this is that in your Docker file, there's a command called expose that makes your container aware that there are some ports that need to be made available that needs to be accessible from the outside world. And then what you can do, and once you have that, you can also, when you run the container, there is an argument that says, please forward this port to this port number. So what that means is that this is gonna get a bit hairy. So what you need to know is that you need to know what is the port from your machine that you want to connect to the Docker container. So for example, you could say that I would like port 5917 in my machine to be forwarded to port 8888 in my Docker container.
So let me jump in and ask. So for instance, this 5987, when you say a part, what exactly is that?
A port, that port.
Oh, okay.
P-O-R-T.
So we want to take that port and say, make this accessible within the container, or is it the opposite? It's saying within the computer, make this port accessible within the container.
It's more like saying, so right now, if you look at in your terminal, in the output, after you run the JupyterLab, right? There's that thing, that address, HTTP 127.0.0.1. that is your local IP address inside the machine, the Docker container, sorry. And then that semicolon 8888, that is the port number. So right now in your Docker container, there is a server that says you can talk to me through port 8888. Now the question is, how do I talk to that server from outside the container? To do that, you need to do a port forwarding. That means in your local machine, you could pick any port, not really any port. There are some practices you need to follow, you should follow, but that's not important for data science. And then you can say that whenever I talk to this port in my local machine, I want Docker to automatically take whatever I send to that port and send it back to inside the container at port 8888.
Okay.
So it seems that right now you have port 888 on your local machine being forwarded to your oh wait, no, okay, we'll check this later. So in your local machine, port 8888 is being forwarded to your Docker container at port 888 as well. That's the first line. Then the second line, 8888, right arrow 127.0.0.1.5987. That says in your local machine, 8888, it will also be forwarded to 5987, which to me is strange. So yeah, I don't know how that first thing, that first port forwarding happened, but I guess since you're able to access the JupyterLab, everything works out. Yeah. And then, so yeah, that is the port forwarding and VS Code. And notice that, you never had to specify the port forwarding yourself, because behind the scenes, VS Code does this. I'm not sure if it does this for every kind of web server, or they actually only support a certain kind of web server, for example, like Jupyter, because it's so common. That's why if you were to spin it up in a container, it can detect that. So what we can do now, just to explore, is that if you go to your web browser, and then in the address, you type localhost semicolon 888. Sorry, quadruple 8. Let's see where that takes you. So yeah, it will take you to the JupyterLab, the same JupyterLab that you created inside the container in VS Code. To verify that, in the password or token, let's paste that token that got displayed when you create that, when you call that JupyterLab command. So login. Yeah, so it's the same instance. So yeah, we can close this. So go back to the VS Code. So, apparently, if you look at those two port lines, right, it's saying that when you type localhost 8888, it will get forwarded to localhost 8888 and then get forwarded back to 127.0.0.1.5987. I don't know. I'm not a network person, but that's looks like what it's doing. Okay, so another thing that can be useful to know is that let's say you forgot or you don't know the URL, because earlier we opened the lab through that URL that you displayed in the terminal, right? But let's say you didn't see that, or there was so many output on the screen and it got passed by. You can actually go to this part of the UI, this port thing, and then click this globe. So try and click that. And that will also open the JupyterLab in the default location, which is the main login page after you log in. Sorry, the main page after you log in.
Perfect.
Right. Okay. So that's that's what I wanted to say about how the connection happens. So it's good to know that VS Code can handle port forwarding automatically for you. And you need to keep this in mind, because sometimes when you want to take things to production, you're so used to it being automated, right? So when you take the same code and the same container and you host it in production, you can't access it, then you start to wonder why. It's because you forgot the infra behind it, the plumbing. Yeah. So that's why I wanted to talk about this. Okay. So let's talk about the JupyterLab interface. So what you should notice is that the interface here, it's very similar to VS Code in the sense that you have a tab interface. So this is a tab. This means that you are able to open multiple notebooks if you want to, and switch between them quite easily, which is, I think, is a step up compared to the traditional Jupyter notebook. Because if you want if you would use a regular Jupyter notebook and you wanted to open another notebook, you have to open a new tab and then go and find a notebook. But here you can actually navigate through this panel here, similar to the Explorer tab in VS Code. So that's really convenient. So let's try and create a new notebook. Yeah, there are multiple ways you can do it, but one easy way is this part here.
Yep.
Yeah, and then what you can do is put a name in the notebook, put a reasonable name.
Oh, can you not type in right here?
Can you right click?
Oh,
yeah, rename notebook. Yeah.
And we could call this, for instance,
Yeah, whatever.
Yeah, Pascal is fine.
So now to show the tab interface, I think we can do that by also opening the Python script so that we can transfer the code from a regular Python script into a notebook format.
Should I open it up here in JupyterLab or go back to the Visual Studio?
You can open it from here.
Okay.
And you can see it opens in another tab. And so it's pretty convenient to transfer code, right? So let's do like one chunk at a time. Let's put all the imports in one cell. And then execute the cell. All right. And then let's paste the next chunk.
So can I actually jump in with a question?
Sure.
Since we're going to be doing some plotting, I often see in Jupyter notebooks a command to start the script dealing with showing graphs inline. Is that common?
Yeah, it's common if you're using matplotlib to do your plotting. And yeah, I guess if you're using plain vanilla Jupyter like this one, then yeah, you should also start the notebook with that percentage matplotlib inline command. I don't think this will work. Can you try execute it? Yeah, there's no space between the
Oh,
percentage and matplotlib. And
there
then
we go.
this also won't work. Oh, it works. Okay.
Yeah.
By the way, that percentage thing is called a magic command. You're familiar with the term?
I'm not now.
Not. Oh, okay. There's actually, so a magic command. Yeah, there's a lot of pretty cool magic commands that is useful to know. This percentage matplotlib is specific to matplotlib, but there are others that are useful as well, like double percentage LaTeX allows you to write LaTeX without having to put that $ in Markdown, for example.
Oh,
Oh,
okay.
and another useful one is timing. So there's a magic command called time,
Mm-hmm.
and that will execute, that will measure how long it takes for the code in your cell to execute. So could be a good way to get a quick overview of, how efficient is your algorithm that you're trying to code out.
Okay, that'll
Yeah.
be worth exploring more maybe in a future episode. Some
Yeah. Yeah. Good idea. Okay. Now back to the transferring.
So, as I think about the script, and I think about the different chunks that I'm doing it in, and that I might want separated in different code chunks,
Mhm.
I tend to think that I would want to copy all of the data or all of the script up through here, which is where I pull the data set from basketballreference.com and save it as a data frame that I'm going to be working with. Thinking that this is all one useful code chunk. Does that seem reasonable, or would you separate it in maybe a different way?
Yeah, that's totally reasonable. And I would just enhance the presentation further. And what I typically do, right, with my Jupyter notebooks is that there are certain headings that is always going to be there. One is introduction. This is for documentation purposes. Introduction, where I explain what's the intent behind this notebook. Then the next heading is libraries, to tell people these are the libraries you need to have to run this code. And then after that, another heading is called data, which shows you how I grab the data. And then the next heading would be data preprocessing, which shows you what are the steps I follow to maybe add new features or clean up the data, that kind of things. And then the last one is analysis, followed by conclusion. Yeah. So when you write your notebooks, it's very good to add headers.
And so when you say add headers, do you mean as comments, as Python comments?
Oh no, no, you're using Jupyter. You shouldn't have to rely on comments. You should be using the Markdown feature. So for example, if you let's add a header called introduction on top of that first cell. So if you insert a new cell on top, so okay, it's okay, yeah, that's not a, I mean, that works, right? But it's not very efficient. Let me show you a shortcut to do that, to insert a cell on top of the current cell.
Okay.
What you need to do is that you need to make sure that you're in the command mode. So I think you should click the escape button. Sorry, press the escape button. Right.
Okay.
So I think, if you see that blue line, it means you are in command mode. And if you were to press A, yeah, that's how. That's
So
how.
would B
Sorry.
go below the cell?
That's right.
Okay.
So when you want to type Markdown in JupyterLab, you need to be in Markdown mode. And to do that, you need to press escape and then M. And so you see what happened there? That bracket is missing. Yep. That you can also toggle that drop down to switch between code and markdown. So yeah, that's how we write markdown with a header to create a header, and then execute. Oh yeah. Feel free to write whatever the short description if you
And
like.
maybe I'll go ahead and do that afterwards. So for next time, we'll have some descriptions in here. But
okay. And then another header called libraries. And then this one, call it data.
Just data.
Hmm.
And then we'll have one for pre-processing the data and so forth.
Yeah. But in this case, I don't think there is, or the processing would be that looping and getting the table. Yeah.
So we have some other processing I had to do just to make sure the data looked correct and add some new features.
Oh, then I would create a heading called pre-processing. And then for the cleaning, I would call it cleaning.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that's interesting. So how do you distinguish between, like, what do you consider pre-processing and what do you consider cleaning?
Pre-processing would be things like creating new features. Cleaning would be things like fixing errors in the data that I know exists. For example, maybe I know that there are some timestamps that are malformed, so I need to fix that.
Okay.
And also like things like outlier removal. So for example, like, in my case, I work with recommended systems, and I know that there are some users who keep on clicking the apply button. I mean, I work in job recommendation systems. They keep on clicking the apply button. So you get cases where the same job gets applied, but in 1 second apart 100 times. This is going to mess up my count. So I want to remove that. That is part of data cleaning.
Okay.
Those kind of things. Yeah.
Interesting. In my field, I always think of those as essentially one thing. That we're just processing the data for analysis. And so I don't often distinguish, at least mentally, between pre-processing and cleaning. So it was interesting to hear some of the different ways of thinking about it. So we'll go ahead and do the same thing. We will go into markdown mode by hitting escape and then M for markdown. We will call this let's see what code we're pasting now. So there are some descriptive statistics, although it's only one line of code for now. We can go ahead and maybe call it descriptive statistics. We'll hit Shift Enter to run it. We can copy in our one line of descriptives. Of course, you'd normally have much more. Here there are a few graphs. As we think about the graphs, would you put each graph in its own code chunk?
I would, because I want to display the graph, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So we can, I suppose we can call all of this descriptive statistics, or maybe exploratory data analysis might be a better name for it.
Or data visualization.
Data visualization.
Or maybe what I usually do is that I will create a header called analysis, and then subheader, descriptive stats, subheader, next subheader is visualization.
Okay, that's a good idea. And so we can modify the headings after. I think we get the sense. Oops.
Can you try to execute one of those visualization plot to just to see whether it gets displayed in line?
Yep, it's just, it was incomplete.
Oh.
There we go.
Because yeah, you need to
I
execute.
know. Yep, I didn't run these up here.
Nice.
So now you can see the real benefit of Jupyter Notebook in action, having everything nice and in line.
That's right.
So we have one more plot. Oops.
And I think in Jupyter, you can actually omit the show, the plt.show. Can you try and remove that? Let's see what happens. Oh, what is this? Scroll down. Cannot insert level 0 already. Ah, your code has a lot of dependencies. Can you try again? You're going to get the same error. Yeah, this is not a problem with Jupyter, it's a problem with your code. you, you are reusing state.
I must have saved something in place.
That's right.
Yeah.
And yeah, the quickest way to fix this is just to, besides rewriting it, is just to reset your environment and run everything from the top. And to do that, if you go to the kernel menu, there should be restart kernel and run all cells. Yeah. But before you do that, can you remove that plt.show?
Yep.
Okay, and then, yeah, restart and run all. Yeah.
Okay, so you don't need the dot show. So now that we have everything in, we have this sort of tabbed interface. What about attaching a console in JupyterLab?
Good question. So in JupyterLab, there's actually a feature that allows you to attach a console. Sorry, there's a feature that allows you to create a console that is attached to your environment, to your notebook environment. And for you to call up that console, I think it's called, you should do file, go to file, and then new console for notebook. And now, for example, to show you that, this console is actually aware of the environment inside your notebook. So if you, let's say, for example, you go to data. So imagine, right, this is your first time seeing this notebook, and you're executing each cell, line by line. And you just wonder, what is soup? What does soup look like? That soup variable. If you were using a normal Jupyter notebook, you probably would have to create a new cell above or below that cell and run just that one command. It works, but it's maybe not so convenient, or you have to modify people's work, that kind of thing, right?
Yeah.
But with JupyterLab, once you execute that cell, you can actually open a console and then type that variable in that input prompt, and then execute, and you see it prints out the content of the variable soup. So you can explore here. You can explore the code without modifying the notebook, which is pretty neat. So to recap, for this session, what did we do? We learned how VS Code established the connection to a JupyterLab server inside a container. And also we had a very brief overview of the interface, the JupyterLab interface, and some of the benefits of writing code in a notebook environment as opposed to a Python script. And we also went through how you can explore code in a Jupyter notebook without having to modify the code, the notebook itself, but exploring it through the console interface. Yeah. Anything else you would like to add, Zach?
Well, I think we also had, although it was a short discussion in there, I think we also had a fruitful discussion thinking about terminologies or workflows in different fields. And I think that's interesting, and I think that's helpful, especially if these videos are helpful for anyone maybe transitioning from a background like mine, more in the sciences and less coding experience, who's interested in, say, a career in data science.
Yeah, good point. All right, then. See you next week, Zach.
Bye, Mohammed.